Unless you do a lot of reading on the subject, it's not likely that you'll ever fully appreciate the control that the state churches in the American colonies had on the citizens of their towns. In the colonies of Massachusetts and Connecticut, the Congregational Church was the state church. In order for a new settlement to be approved in those colonies, they had to meet two requirements. First, they had to have the required minimum number of families, usually 20 or 25. And second, their proposed settlement had to have their own pastor. When I first read that in the history section of several different New England libraries several decades ago, I thought, wow, that's pretty awesome. Our New England colonies were built on a Christian foundation. And though that was basically true, I didn't realize at the time the implications of that standard. For one thing, under that requirement, the marriage of the church and the state was inevitable. In addition, there was no requirement as to the spiritual qualifications of the town pastor. The state church environment in those colonies deteriorated into conditions that we would all agree were wrong. No one could worship or preach without being sanctioned by the state church. Citizens were not permitted to follow their conscience. And people were required to support the town church financially, whether or not they agreed with the church. In the 1700s, in Norwich, Connecticut, Pastor Lord, the pastor of the state church in town, walked into a barber shop and said to the barber, "I've come to collect on a bill." The barber said, "I don't know you. Who are you?" Pastor Lord said, "I'm the pastor of the town church, and you owe me a fee for my preaching." The barber said, "I've never been inside your church." Pastor Lord said, "That's not my fault. The doors were open." So the barber said, "Well, as long as you're here, let me collect my fee for cutting your hair." The pastor said, "I've never been in your shop before." The barber said, "That's not my fault. The doors were open." This was the climate in the colonies when George Whitefield came through preaching in the 1740s. The state churches throughout the colonies were filled with cold, dead, lifeless religion. Whitefield insisted that churches be comprised of born-again people. So when people trusted Christ under his preaching, he urged them to not go to the state churches, but to form new congregations. These churches came to be called separate churches, and a large percentage of these separate churches, in sincerely pursuing the truth of the Bible, became Baptist churches. This bothered Whitefield so much that he's quoted as saying, "My little chicks have become ducks," referring to immersion. So while Whitefield was not a Baptist, he inadvertently fueled the Baptist cause throughout the colonies by bringing multitudes to Christ and steering them away from the state churches. The Baptists knew that Whitefield didn't agree with their doctrine on baptism, but they loved and respected him nonetheless. The Baptist church planting movement that emerged from the Great Awakening throughout the colonies and into the frontier is immeasurable. And God's providence in all this is clear, as demonstrated by a letter written by Benjamin Franklin to George Whitefield, dated July 2nd, 1756, 20 years before we became a nation. It's no secret that Benjamin Franklin and George Whitefield were good friends who shared a great respect for each other. The letter indicates the profound impact that George Whitefield had on the man who was at the time our most revered founding father. And it also reveals the level of Mr. Franklin's faith, which is not consistent with the way he's often portrayed today. Benjamin Franklin writes, "You mention your frequent wish that you were a chaplain in the American Army. I sometimes wish that you and I were jointly employed by the Crown to settle a colony on the Ohio. But I fear we shall never be called upon for such a service. What a glorious thing it would be to settle in that fine country a large, strong body of religious and industrious people. What a security to the other colonies, an advantage to Britain by increasing her people, territory, strength, and commerce. Might it not greatly facilitate the introduction of pure religion among the heathen, if we could, by such a colony, show them a better sample of Christians than they commonly see in our Indian traders, the most vicious and abandoned wretches of our nation? Being now in the last act of my life, I begin to cast about for something fit to end with. I'm very desirous of concluding with a bright point. In such an enterprise, I could spend the remainder of life with pleasure, and I firmly believe God would bless us with success if we undertake it with a sincere regard to His honor. Benjamin Franklin had no idea at that point the great role he would play in the founding of our nation. Neither did he know about the future states that would be established along the Ohio River, where he dreamed of building a colony: Ohio, West Virginia, Indiana, and Kentucky. And he certainly had no idea that the solid Christian influence that he hoped to bring to that region would be brought there largely through the efforts of the Baptists, whose vision and burden for souls originated largely with the preaching of his good friend, George Whitefield. Praise God for the way he used the ministry of George Whitefield in the lives of American colonists, in the establishing of many thousands of Baptist churches, and in the founding and the development of our nation. Christian, God is in control of the ministry of the gospel of Jesus Christ. Stay the course.